The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked beside his mother, Catherine. The young prince had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Today was different from his usual royal duties. Today, he would meet the veterans at the annual remembrance ceremony, and his grandmother had told him stories about brave soldiers that made his heart race with excitement and curiosity. George wore his small navy blazer, perfectly pressed, with a tiny poppy pinned to his lapel. His shoes were polished to mirror brightness, and his hair was combed neatly to one side. But despite his formal appearance, his eyes sparkled with the wonder that only a child could possess. He had spent the previous evening asking his father endless questions about the soldiers, about their medals, and about what it meant to serve one's country. As they approached the memorial garden, George noticed something that made him pause. Standing perfectly still near the entrance was an elderly man in a wheelchair. The man wore a military uniform decorated with numerous medals that caught the sunlight. His weathered hands rested on the wheels of his chair, and his eyes stared straight ahead with a dignity that spoke of years of service and sacrifice. What struck George most was not the man's uniform or his medals, but the single tear that rolled down his cheek. The old soldier seemed lost in memories, perhaps thinking of friends who never came home, battles fought in distant lands, or the weight of carrying stories that younger generations could never fully understand. The man's name was Thomas Hartwell, though George didn't know this yet. Thomas was 92 years old and had served in conflicts that shaped the world George now lived in safely. Catherine noticed her son had stopped walking and followed his gaze. She was about to gently guide him along when she saw what had captured his attention. The sight of the elderly veteran, sitting alone in his quiet contemplation, touched her heart as well. She knelt beside George and whispered softly, "He's remembering his friends, darling. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they think about people they miss very much." George nodded solemnly, his young mind trying to process the weight of what his mother had just explained. He had learned about sadness and missing people when his great-grandmother passed away, but this felt different somehow. This felt bigger, more important, like something that connected to all the stories his family had told him about duty, service, and caring for others. The remembrance ceremony was beautiful and moving. George stood quietly during the 2 minutes of silence, watching as hundreds of people bowed their heads in respect. He saw young soldiers standing tall and proud, middle-aged men and women with tears in their eyes, and elderly veterans like Thomas, each carrying their own memories and stories of service. When the last note of the bugle call faded away, George felt something shift inside his chest. He couldn't name the feeling, but it was powerful and warm, and made him want to do something meaningful. After the official ceremony ended, families began to mingle and share stories. George watched as people approached various veterans to thank them for their service. He saw his parents speaking with military officials, shaking hands, and listening to stories with genuine interest and respect. But his eyes kept drifting back to Thomas, who remained somewhat apart from the crowds, still sitting quietly in his wheelchair. Catherine noticed her son's continued focus on the elderly veteran. "Would you like to meet him?" she asked gently. George nodded eagerly, but as they began to approach, something unexpected happened. A small group of children from a local school choir who had performed during the ceremony came running past. They were laughing and playing, full of energy after their formal performance. One of the children, a girl about George's age, accidentally bumped into Thomas's wheelchair while chasing her friend. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to startle the old man. The girl stopped immediately, her face turning red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked down at the child with kind eyes. "No harm done, young lady," he said with a gentle smile. "You remind me of my granddaughter when she was your age." always full of life and energy." The girl smiled back, relieved, and ran off to rejoin her friends. But George had seen something in that brief interaction that the adults around him had missed. When the girl bumped into the wheelchair, Thomas had instinctively reached out to steady himself, and in doing so, he had dropped something. A small, worn photograph had fallen from his lap and slid under a nearby bench. Without hesitation, George left his mother's side and walked over to where the photograph had fallen. He got down on his hands and knees, not caring about his perfectly pressed blazer, and crawled under the bench to retrieve it. When he emerged, holding the precious photograph carefully in his small hands, he found himself looking at a black and white picture of 5 young men in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, all smiling broadly at the camera. George stood up and approached Thomas's wheelchair. The old veteran hadn't yet noticed that he had dropped the photograph. He was still watching the children play, a wistful expression on his face. George cleared his throat softly and held out the photograph. "Excuse me, sir," George said politely, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation that had been drilled into him since he was very young. "I think you dropped this." Thomas looked down at the photograph in the young prince's hands, and his eyes immediately filled with fresh tears. "Oh, my goodness," he whispered, reaching out with trembling hands to take the precious picture. "Thank you so much, young man. This photograph, it's all I have left of my unit. We called ourselves the 5 Brothers, even though we weren't related by blood. They were my family during the war." George studied the faces in the photograph with the intense curiosity that children possess. "They look happy," he observed. "They were," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "This was taken just before our last mission together. I was the only one who came home." He paused, looking down at the photograph with infinite tenderness. "I carry them with me everywhere I go. If I had lost this picture—" His voice trailed off, but George understood. Even at 8 years old, he grasped the importance of what he had just returned to this kind man. The photograph wasn't just a picture. It was a connection to people who had meant everything to Thomas, people who had given their lives for the freedom that George and his generation now enjoyed. "What were their names?" George asked, settling down on the grass beside Thomas's wheelchair with the natural ease of a child who hadn't yet learned to be intimidated by the weight of history or the formality of such occasions. Thomas's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Most people, especially children, didn't ask for the stories. They might say a quick thank you for his service and move on, but this young boy seemed genuinely interested in hearing about the men in the photograph. "Well," Thomas began, his voice growing stronger as he prepared to honor his friend's memories, "this one here is Jimmy Patterson. He was only 19 when this picture was taken. Jimmy could make anyone laugh, even in the worst of times. He used to say that laughter was the best weapon against fear." He pointed to another face. "And this is Robert Chen. Bobby was the smartest person I've ever known. He could figure out any problem, fix any broken equipment, and he always knew exactly what to do in difficult situations." As Thomas continued to share the stories of his fallen comrades, a small crowd began to gather. Other veterans, curious about what was drawing such attention, moved closer. Some brought their own families, including grandchildren who were about George's age. Catherine watched from a respectful distance, her heart swelling with pride as she observed her son's genuine interest and compassion. "This is Marcus Williams," Thomas continued, pointing to a tall, broad-shouldered young man in the center of the photograph. "Marcus was our leader, though he was only 21. He had a way of making each of us feel braver than we really were. He used to write letters to his little sister back home every single day, no matter where we were or what was happening around us." "Did she get all the letters?" George asked, leaning closer to get a better look at Marcus's face. "Most of them," Thomas replied. After he didn't come home, his family shared some of those letters with us. He wrote about his dreams for the future. about the family he wanted to have, about the peaceful world he was fighting to create. He wrote about how much he believed in the importance of kindness and understanding between people of different backgrounds and beliefs. The last person in the photograph was a young man with a serious expression, but kind eyes. "And this," Thomas said, his voice becoming very quiet, "is David O'Sullivan. David was my best friend. We grew up in the same neighborhood, enlisted together, and promised our mothers we'd look out for each other. David saved my life more times than I can count. He was supposed to be best man at my wedding when we got home." "Did you still have your wedding?" George asked, with the straightforward curiosity of a child. "I did," Thomas smiled sadly. "My wife, Margaret, insisted that David would have wanted us to be happy. She said that the best way to honor his memory was to live the life he had helped make possible. We were married for 68 wonderful years before she passed away last spring." George was quiet for a moment, processing all the stories he had just heard. Around them, the gathered crowd listened respectfully, many wiping away tears as Thomas shared his memories. These weren't just stories about war. They were stories about friendship, sacrifice, love, and the bonds that connect people across time and circumstance. "Mr. Thomas," George said finally, using the respectful address his parents had taught him, "I think your friends would be very proud of you for keeping their memory alive and sharing their stories with people like me." Thomas looked down at this remarkable young boy, who had not only returned his precious photograph, but had also given him the gift of listening to his stories with genuine interest and respect. "You know, young man," he said, "you've given me something very special today. It's been a long time since someone your age wanted to hear about Jimmy and Bobby and Marcus and David. Usually, people your age are too busy with their games and their phones to care about old stories from old men." "These aren't old stories," George replied with the clear logic of childhood. "These are important stories about brave people who helped make the world safe for kids like me. My father always tells me that the most important thing we can do is listen to people and learn from them, especially people who have done important things." As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the memorial garden, George realized that his parents would probably be looking for him soon. The formal part of the ceremony had ended some time ago, and other families were beginning to make their way home. But he found himself reluctant to leave Thomas, who seemed to have more stories to tell and who appeared to be enjoying the conversation as much as George was. "I have to go soon," George said regretfully. "But Mr. Thomas, would it be okay if I wrote you a letter sometime? I'd like to hear more stories about your friends. And maybe I could tell you about some of the things I'm learning at school." Thomas's eyes filled with tears once again, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Young man," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "nothing would make me happier. It's been such a long time since I've had a proper pen pal." As George stood up to leave, brushing the grass from his blazer, he made a decision that would surprise everyone around him, including himself. Instead of simply saying goodbye and walking away, he did something that came naturally to him, but was completely unexpected given the formal setting and the many people watching. George stepped forward and, without saying a word, placed his small hand gently on Thomas's shoulder. Then, in a gesture that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his young heart, he stood up straight and gave Thomas a perfect military salute. The movement was crisp and respectful, executed with the precision he had observed from the soldiers during the ceremony. The effect of this simple gesture was immediate and profound. Thomas straightened in his wheelchair, his weathered face breaking into the widest smile anyone had seen from him all day. Instinctively, he returned the salute with military precision that spoke of decades of service and training. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the elderly veteran and the young prince held their salute, connecting across generations through a shared understanding of respect, duty, and honor. The crowd that had gathered around them fell completely silent. Many of the adults watching felt tears spring to their eyes as they witnessed this pure moment of connection between the old and the young. Here was a child who understood, perhaps better than many adults, the importance of showing respect to those who had served and sacrificed. When George finally lowered his hand and smiled at Thomas, the old veteran reached out and gently took the boy's hand in both of his own. "That," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the finest salute I have ever received in my 92 years of life. Thank you, young man. You have honored not just me, but the memory of Jimmy, Bobby, Marcus, and David as well." Catherine, who had been watching from a distance, felt her heart swell with pride and love for her son. She had always known that George possessed a special sensitivity and kindness. But seeing him interact with Thomas with such genuine compassion and respect confirmed what she had always believed about his character. This was not something that could be taught through formal lessons or protocol training. This came from George's natural empathy and his ability to see beyond surfaces to the person underneath. As other families began to approach Thomas, inspired by George's example, the elderly veteran found himself surrounded by children eager to hear his stories and adults wanting to express their gratitude for his service. What had begun as a solitary memorial visit had transformed into an impromptu gathering where stories were shared, connections were made, and the gap between generations was bridged through mutual respect and understanding. A little girl named Emma, who had been watching George's interaction with Thomas, tugged on her grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma," she whispered, "can we talk to the soldier too?" Her grandmother, who was herself a military spouse, smiled and nodded. Soon Emma was sitting beside Thomas's wheelchair, listening with wide eyes as he told her about David O'Sullivan's love of music and how he used to play harmonica for the unit during quiet evenings. An older boy named Michael, about 10 years old, approached with his father and asked Thomas about the medals on his uniform. Thomas patiently explained each one, telling the stories behind the commendations and helping Michael understand the difference between medals for service and medals for specific acts of bravery. Michael's father, who was an active-duty soldier himself, listened with deep respect as Thomas shared wisdom gained through decades of experience and reflection. As the afternoon progressed, George found himself becoming the unofficial bridge between Thomas and the other children. When a shy 6-year-old named Lucy seemed too nervous to approach the veteran directly, George gently took her hand and introduced her to Thomas, explaining that he was a very kind man who loved to tell stories. When twins named Sarah and Sophie couldn't decide which of them should ask Thomas their question about what soldiers ate during the war, George suggested they ask together, showing them how to be polite and take turns listening. Through it all, Thomas seemed to grow younger and more energetic with each interaction. The sadness that had marked his expression at the beginning of the day was replaced by joy and a sense of purpose. He was no longer just an old man sitting alone with his memories. He was a storyteller, a keeper of history, a living connection to events that had shaped the world these children would inherit. One particularly touching moment came when 8-year-old James, whose own grandfather had served in the military but had passed away before James was born, asked Thomas if he thought his grandfather would have been friends with the men in the photograph. Thomas studied James's earnest face and then smiled warmly. "You know what, James?" he said. "I believe that all soldiers, regardless of when or where they served, share a special bond. Your grandfather and my friends would have understood each other perfectly, because they all shared the same desire to protect the people and the country they loved." James beamed at this answer, and his mother later told Catherine that it was the first time since his grandfather's death that James had seemed truly at peace with his loss. The healing power of Thomas's words and George's example of reaching out to connect with others was creating ripples of comfort and understanding throughout the gathered families. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the memorial garden, George realized that this day had become something much more significant than just a formal ceremony. It had become a celebration of memory, connection, and the enduring power of human kindness. He had learned about history not from textbooks or formal lessons, but from sitting on the grass and listening to a man share the stories of his heart. Catherine approached her son as families began to say their goodbyes to Thomas. "George," she said gently, "it's time for us to head home. You've had quite an extraordinary afternoon." George nodded, but turned back to Thomas one more time. "Mr. Thomas," he said, "I meant what I said about writing you letters. And maybe sometime you could visit us and tell more stories. I have friends who would love to meet you and hear about Jimmy and Bobby and Marcus and David." Thomas's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure, young man. And perhaps you could tell me about your own adventures and the things you're learning. I may be old, but I'm always eager to learn new things from young people like yourself." As they prepared to part ways, something unexpected happened that would become the most memorable moment of an already unforgettable day. One of the castle guards, a young man named Sergeant William Foster, had been watching the interactions between George and Thomas from his post near the Memorial Garden entrance. Sergeant Foster was responsible for maintaining security and ensuring that protocol was followed during royal visits, but what he had witnessed that afternoon had moved him deeply. Sergeant Foster had served 2 tours of duty himself and understood the importance of honoring veterans and preserving their stories. He had watched with growing admiration as George had shown such genuine respect and kindness to Thomas, and he had been touched by the way the young prince had inspired other children to connect with the elderly veteran as well. As George and Catherine began to walk toward their departure point, Sergeant Foster made a decision that went against standard protocol but felt absolutely right in his heart. Instead of maintaining his rigid post, he stepped forward and approached Thomas's wheelchair. Without saying a word, he came to attention and gave Thomas a crisp military salute. Thomas, surprised but deeply moved, returned the salute with the same precision he had shown George. But Sergeant Foster wasn't finished. He then turned toward George and, recognizing the young prince's role in creating this meaningful afternoon, he also saluted him. It was a gesture that acknowledged not just George's royal status, but his character, his compassion, and his ability to bring people together. George, understanding the significance of the gesture, returned the salute with the same respect he had shown Thomas. In that moment, a chain of connection was formed that linked the young prince, the elderly veteran, and the active duty soldier in a bond of mutual respect and shared values. Other guards and military personnel who were present witnessed Sergeant Foster's actions. Rather than viewing it as a breach of protocol, they recognized it as a moment of genuine honor and respect. One by one, other soldiers began to step forward, each offering their own salute to Thomas and, by extension, to all the veterans whose stories deserved to be remembered and honored. The scene that unfolded was both spontaneous and deeply moving. Here, in a simple memorial garden, military personnel from different generations and different conflicts found themselves united by their shared commitment to service and their recognition of the importance of remembering those who had sacrificed for their country. Catherine watched with amazement as her 8-year-old son became the catalyst for this remarkable demonstration of military solidarity and respect. She realized that George had accomplished something that formal ceremonies and official speeches often failed to achieve. He had created a genuine human connection that transcended rank, age, and protocol. As the impromptu ceremony concluded and the soldiers returned to their posts, Thomas found himself surrounded by a crowd of people who had been touched by what they had witnessed. Parents thanked him for sharing his stories with their children. Veterans approached to exchange contact information and continue conversations, and children promised to write letters and send drawings. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the afternoon was the change that had occurred in Thomas himself. The lonely, sad figure who had arrived at the memorial garden that morning had been transformed into a man with renewed purpose and connection to his community. He now had new friends of all ages, people who wanted to hear his stories and who understood the importance of preserving the memory of his fallen comrades. As George finally departed with his mother, he turned back one last time to wave at Thomas. The elderly veteran smiled and waved back, clutching the precious photograph of his 5 brothers in one hand, while using the other to acknowledge the young prince who had given him such an unexpected gift of friendship and respect. "You know, George," Catherine said as they walked toward their car, "what you did today was very special. You showed genuine kindness and respect to someone who deserved both, and you helped other people understand the importance of listening to and learning from our veterans." George considered this for a moment. "Mom," he said finally, "Mr. Thomas wasn't just telling me old stories. He was sharing the most important things in his life. When people trust you with their most important things, you have to treat them very carefully and with respect." Catherine smiled at her son's wisdom. "That's exactly right, darling. And by showing that respect, you helped Mr. Thomas feel valued and appreciated. You also showed other children that it's important to connect with people who have different experiences and stories to share." As their car pulled away from the memorial garden, George watched through the window as Thomas continued to chat with families who had lingered to hear more of his stories. The sight filled him with satisfaction and joy, knowing that his simple gesture of returning a dropped photograph had led to something much larger and more meaningful than he could have imagined when the day began. 3 weeks after the memorial ceremony, George sat at his desk in Kensington Palace, carefully writing his first letter to Thomas. He had been thinking about their conversation every day since they met, and he had so many questions he wanted to ask and so many things he wanted to share. The letter writing had been his own idea, though his parents had been delighted to help him with the practical arrangements. The letter began simply, "Dear Mr. Thomas, I hope you are doing well. I have been thinking about you and your friends, Jimmy, Bobby, Marcus, and David, every day since we met. I wanted to tell you about some things I have been learning at school and ask you some more questions about your time as a soldier." George wrote about his history lessons, describing how his teacher had been impressed when he shared some of Thomas's stories with the class. He told Thomas about a book he was reading about World War II and how it helped him understand better the kinds of challenges that Thomas and his friends had faced. He also mentioned that he had started a small project at school where students could interview elderly relatives or family friends about their experiences during different historical periods. But the most important part of George's letter was a question that showed how deeply Thomas's stories had affected him. "Mr. Thomas," he wrote, "you said that Marcus used to write letters to his little sister every day. Do you think it would be okay if I wrote letters to Jimmy and Bobby and Marcus and David too? I know they can't write back, but I thought maybe if I told them about the world they helped create, it might be a way to honor their memory like you do." When Thomas received the letter a few days later, he was so moved that he had to sit down and compose himself before he could read it completely. The idea that this young boy wanted to write letters to his fallen comrades touched him more deeply than anything had since Margaret's passing. He immediately began writing his response, sharing more stories and encouraging George's idea about writing to his friends. Thus began a correspondence that would continue for months and eventually grow into something much larger than either George or Thomas could have imagined. Thomas's letters were filled with detailed stories about his war experiences, but also about his life afterward, his marriage to Margaret, his career as a school teacher, and his thoughts on the changes he had witnessed in the world over his 9 decades of life. George's letters were equally thoughtful, sharing his observations about current events, his questions about history and human nature, and his growing understanding of concepts like duty, service, and sacrifice. His parents were amazed by the maturity and depth of thought that emerged in his correspondence with Thomas, and they began to realize that this friendship was providing their son with a unique form of education that no formal curriculum could match. Word of the friendship between the young prince and the elderly veteran began to spread, first within royal circles and then more broadly. The story captured people's imagination because it represented something pure and meaningful in a world that often seemed complicated and divided. Here was a genuine connection between two people from different generations, different backgrounds, and different life experiences, united by mutual respect and shared values. 6 months after their first meeting, Thomas received an invitation that left him speechless. George had asked his parents if Thomas could visit Kensington Palace for tea, and they had readily agreed. The invitation was not for a formal state visit or a photo opportunity, but for a simple afternoon visit where George could introduce Thomas to his siblings and show him some of the things he had been learning and working on. The day of the visit arrived with perfect spring weather. Thomas, dressed in his finest civilian clothes with his military medals carefully pinned to his blazer, was driven to Kensington Palace in a car provided by the royal household. As he was escorted to the private family quarters, he marveled at the history surrounding him while remaining focused on the simple joy of seeing his young friend again. George met Thomas at the door with a smile that could have lit up the entire palace. "Mr. Thomas!" he exclaimed, careful to maintain the respectful address his parents had taught him while showing genuine excitement at their reunion. "I'm so happy you're here. I have so many things to show you." The afternoon that followed was magical in its simplicity. George showed Thomas the letters he had written to Jimmy, Bobby, Marcus, and David, carefully preserved in a special folder that he had decorated with drawings of poppies and flags. He had written dozens of letters over the months, telling the fallen soldiers about current events, about his own life and experiences, and about the peaceful world they had helped create. Thomas read each letter with growing amazement and emotion. George had written to Jimmy about a comedy show that had made him laugh until his sides hurt, explaining how important laughter was for dealing with difficult times. He had written to Bobby about a science project he was working on, describing new technologies and discoveries that showed how human intelligence could be used to solve problems and help people. The letters to Marcus were particularly touching, as George had written about his own growing understanding of leadership and responsibility. He told Marcus about times when he had to be brave, about the importance of being kind to younger children, and about his dreams for the future. The letters to David were filled with stories about friendship, about the importance of keeping promises, and about how George tried to be loyal and trustworthy, like David had been. "George," Thomas said after reading through the entire collection, "these letters are the most beautiful tribute to my friends that I could ever have imagined. You have understood something about each of them that honors who they were as people, not just as soldiers." But George had an even bigger surprise for Thomas. He had convinced his parents to help him organize a special event at the palace, and he had invited several families from the memorial ceremony to join them for the afternoon. Emma arrived with her grandmother, bringing drawings she had made of the stories Thomas had told her. Michael came with his father, carrying a school report he had written about military service inspired by his conversation with Thomas. James arrived with his mother, bringing a photo of his grandfather in uniform that he wanted to show Thomas. Lucy came with both her parents, no longer shy but eager to ask Thomas more questions about life during wartime. The twins, Sarah and Sophie, brought a song they had learned about remembrance and friendship. As the afternoon progressed, the palace drawing room was filled with the sound of children's laughter, the sharing of stories, and the building of connections across generations. Thomas found himself at the center of an impromptu gathering that felt more like a family reunion than a formal royal function. William and Catherine joined the group, bringing tea and homemade biscuits, and they too became part of the conversation. Catherine shared stories about her own grandparents' experiences during the war, while William talked about his military service and what it had taught him about leadership and sacrifice. The most meaningful moment of the afternoon came when George made an announcement that surprised everyone, including his parents. "Mr. Thomas," he said, standing up with the formal bearing he used for important pronouncements, "I have been thinking about something for a long time, and I want to ask you a very important question." The room fell silent as everyone waited to hear what the young prince had to say. "Would you consider being my honorary grandfather?" George asked, his voice clear but carrying a slight tremor of nervousness. "I know that sounds strange because we're not related, but you have taught me so many important things, and you have shared your most precious memories with me. I would be very honored if you would let me be like a grandson to you." Thomas was so moved that he couldn't speak for several minutes. The other adults in the room found themselves wiping away tears as they witnessed this extraordinary offer of love and connection. Finally, Thomas found his voice. "Young man," he said, reaching out to take George's hands in his own, "nothing would make me prouder or happier than to be your honorary grandfather. You have brought more joy and purpose into my life than I ever thought possible at my age. I would be deeply honored to have you as my honorary grandson." The two hugged then, a moment that was witnessed by everyone in the room and that seemed to symbolize something larger about the human capacity for connection, love, and mutual support across all the boundaries that society might try to create. As the afternoon drew to a close and families began to prepare for departure, Thomas realized that what had started as a chance encounter at a memorial ceremony had blossomed into something that had changed his entire life. He was no longer a lonely widower with only his memories for company. He now had an extended family of friends who valued his stories, respected his experiences, and included him in their lives. The friendship between George and Thomas continued to flourish over the following years. Thomas became a regular visitor to royal events, not as a formal guest, but as family. He attended George's birthday parties, school performances, and holiday celebrations. In return, George visited Thomas at his home, helped him with his garden, and continued to write letters that Thomas treasured above all his other possessions. The impact of their friendship extended far beyond their personal relationship. Inspired by George's example, schools across the country began organizing programs that connected children with elderly veterans. These adoption programs allowed young people to learn about history from those who had lived it, while providing elderly veterans with renewed purpose and social connection. Thomas became something of a celebrity speaker, invited to schools and youth organizations to share his stories and answer questions from curious young minds. He always began these presentations by telling the story of how he met a young boy who returned a dropped photograph and ended up changing his entire perspective on life. The royal family quietly supported these educational initiatives, with Catherine and William attending several school events where veterans shared their stories with students. They recognized that George's natural empathy and curiosity had opened a door to a different kind of community service, one based on genuine human connection rather than formal obligation. As Thomas grew older and his health began to decline, George remained a constant presence in his life. When Thomas was hospitalized with pneumonia at age 94, George convinced his parents to let him visit every day. He would sit beside Thomas's bed, reading him letters from other children who had heard their story, sharing news from school, and simply being present during a difficult time. It was during one of these hospital visits that Thomas made a request that would become his final gift to George and to all the young people who had been touched by their friendship. He asked George to help him write a book that would preserve not just his own stories, but the stories of Jimmy, Bobby, Marcus, and David for future generations. Working together over several months, George and Thomas created a collection of stories that captured not just the historical facts of military service, but the human emotions, relationships, and experiences that gave those facts meaning. The book included the letters that George had written to the fallen soldiers, photos from Thomas's military service, and reflections on the importance of remembering and honoring those who had sacrificed for their country. The book, titled Letters to Fallen Friends, A Story of Memory, Friendship, and Honor, became a bestseller, with all proceeds donated to veterans organizations and programs that connected young people with elderly community members. More importantly, it became a teaching tool used in schools to help children understand the personal cost of war and the importance of peace. Thomas lived to see the book's publication and to attend its launch event, which was held at the same memorial garden where he and George had first met. Surrounded by hundreds of children, veterans, and families who had been touched by their story, Thomas reflected on how a simple act of kindness from a young boy had led to so much unexpected joy and connection. A year later, Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 96. At his funeral, which was attended by members of the royal family and hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, George delivered a eulogy that brought everyone to tears. He spoke about the lessons Thomas had taught him about the importance of listening to others, honoring memory, and building bridges between generations. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Thomas's memory was what happened after his death. The programs he and George had inspired continued to flourish, connecting thousands of young people with elderly community members who had stories to share and wisdom to offer. Schools reported that students who participated in these programs showed increased empathy, better understanding of history, and stronger connections to their communities. George, now older but still carrying the lessons he had learned from his honorary grandfather, continued to advocate for these intergenerational programs. He spoke about Thomas's influence on his life and encouraged other young people to seek out relationships with older community members who could share their experiences and perspectives. The memorial garden where George and Thomas had first met became an official site for annual remembrance ceremonies that specifically honored the connections between generations. A small plaque was installed there reading simply, "In memory of Thomas Heartfelt and all who serve, dedicated to the power of friendship across generations and the importance of listening to one another's stories." The story of Prince George and Thomas Heartfelt became a lasting reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in the world begin with simple acts of human kindness and genuine curiosity about one another's experiences. Their friendship demonstrated that respect, compassion, and the willingness to listen can bridge any gap of age, background, or circumstance, creating connections that enrich lives and strengthen communities for generations to come.